You've been sitting at this table for 20 minutes, pretending to understand a balance sheet you couldn't read if your life depended on it. Donovan Hale, 52, the chief financial officer of Ashford Timber, and the man who had spent the last 11 years believing the company ran because he allowed it to run, said it at the center of the Ashford Timber annual board dinner, surrounded by investors, regional directors, and the three largest landholders in British Columbia's private forestry sector. He said it loudly enough that the table went quiet. He said it looking directly at his daughter-in-law, Marelle Ashford Hale, 37, the quiet wife of Donovan's son Callister, and the concealed majority owner of Ashford Timber through the Beaumont Ridge Trust, set down her water glass and looked at her father-in-law without changing her expression. Around her sat people who had known her mother. Around her sat people who understood exactly what the Beaumont Ridge Trust meant. None of them corrected Donovan. They had learned over many years that correcting Donovan in public was something you only did once. Beside Callister sat Ingrid Solberg, 35, the ambitious head of regional development at West Pine Partners and Callister's mistress, though only 3 people in the room knew that for certain. She smiled at Donovan's words as though she had been waiting for them. Across the table, Callister Hale, 41, Marelle's husband and Donovan's eldest son, lifted his wine glass and said nothing. That silence was its own kind of answer. What none of them knew was that the balance sheet Marelle had been reading was one she had authored herself. Through the trust her mother, Eloise Beaumont, had built from scratch across 42 years in the lumber trade. What none of them knew was that Marelle had spotted 4 irregular line items before the salad course arrived. What none of them knew was that the woman Donovan had just humiliated in front of 60 people held the legal authority to remove every nameplate in that building before morning. Marielle looked at Donovan once. Then she looked at her husband. Then she folded her napkin and placed it on the table. Stay with this story until the end, because the woman Donovan mocked at that dinner is the same woman whose family built every road, mill and contract route his career had ever touched. And before this is over, she is going to cost him his title, his son's future, and the version of the company he spent a decade pretending was his. The smell of cedar in the Beaumont Ridge Mill was something Mireille had carried since childhood, not metaphorically, literally. The scent clung to her mother's coat, to the leather-bound ledgers stacked in the back study, to the old boots Eloise Beaumont wore every February when she personally walked the harvest boundaries through 2 feet of British Columbia snow. Mary had walked those same boundaries at 12 years old, her fingers going numb inside 2 large gloves, watching her mother count trees the way other parents counted blessings. Eloise Beaumont had built Ashford Timber from a single sawmill in the Okanagan in the early 1980s, at a time when bank managers laughed at women in plaid coats asking for commercial loans. She had taken 3 rejections, borrowed from her grandmother, and signed her first timber license under a name that didn't invite questions. By the time the industry understood who she had already become someone they couldn't afford to ignore. When Eloise died, Mireille was 29. The trust was already in place. The Beaumont Ridge Trust had been structured quietly, deliberately, and with the kind of legal precision that came from a woman who had spent 40 years watching people try to take things from her. Mary's ownership was protected, documented, and recognized by the board. The external auditors knew. 3 senior officers knew. The lawyers knew. What the Hale family knew was that Mireille was Eloise's daughter, which they understood to mean she was sentimental and probably in over her head. Callister had proposed to Mireille 2 years after Eloise died. She had accepted because she believed he was the kind of man who loved quietly, who built things instead of claiming them, who would not become her father-in-law. She had been wrong about all 3. The morning of the board dinner began at the Beaumont Ridge Mill property outside Kelowna, where Mireille had driven alone before dawn. She did this every year on the day of the annual dinner, not because the schedule required it, but because her mother had. Eloise Beaumont believed you should smell the work before you talked about it in a boardroom. Mireille had never found a reason to stop believing the same thing. The mill manager, a 61-year-old man named Aldrich Sorrell, who had worked under Eloise for 23 years, met her at the gate with a clipboard and a coffee that was already going cold. He didn't say Mrs. Hale. He never had. He said Miss Beaumont under his breath, as if the name itself had to be handled carefully. She asked about the output reports. He told her. She asked about the safety audit. He told her that too. Then he hesitated, and Mireille had learned over the years that Aldrich only hesitated when something was wrong enough that he wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. The Thompson Creek log volume numbers had been recategorized, he said. Not by the mill, by the finance office in Vancouver. Mireille set down her coffee. Recategorized how? The short answer was that a significant volume of contracted timber had been logged under a Westpine Partners joint development code, which would give a third-party company access to Ashford's preferred harvest windows without going through proper trust-level approval. The longer answer involved 3 months of altered routing records and a finance manager who had been signing off on changes that should have required board review. Mare looked out at the mill yard. The machines were already running. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird she couldn't name was making a sound she associated entirely with her mother being alive. She called Priscilla Wentworth, 48, her private attorney and the legal counsel for the Beaumont Ridge Trust. "How quickly can we prepare emergency board documentation?" she asked. Priscilla said, "It's been ready for 6 weeks. We were waiting on you." Mariel looked at the mill one more time before getting back in her car. She arrived at the dinner wearing the same kind of understated dress she always wore to Ashford events. Dove grey, nothing that asked for a second look. She had learned to wear things that let people underestimate her without feeling like they were working at it. Callister met her in the hotel lobby. He looked past her shoulder before he looked at her face. That had been happening for 8 months. "You look fine," he said. "Just don't get into discussions about the Thompson Creek numbers tonight. Leave that to the people who handle it." Mirelle looked at him. She had spent the morning at the mill. She had just gotten off the phone with her lawyer. She had a document in her bag that could structure the entire evening, and Callister was asking her not to discuss finance. She said nothing. That was still the reflex after all these years. The habit her mother had also carried for too long. The dinner was held in the Palliser room of one of Vancouver's oldest hotels, a room Mirelle's mother had rented for 22 consecutive years of Ashford Timber annual events. The chandeliers were original. The table could seat 70. The napkins were folded the same way every time because Eloise had once told the hotel coordinator how she liked them, and they had never asked again. Ingrid Solberg arrived 20 minutes into the pre-dinner reception wearing a dark green dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carrying the specific kind of smile that belonged to someone who believed she already knew how the night would end. She found Callister before she found her place card. She touched his arm briefly, the way you touch something you consider yours, and said, "I wasn't sure if Mireille was coming." The sentence was aimed at no one in particular. It landed on everyone. Mireille watched Callister's jaw shift. He was not going to correct Ingrid. She had understood that by the third time it happened. Donovan arrived last, as he always did, taking the chair at the far end of the table that no one else sat in because everyone at Ashford Timber had learned that Donovan sat there. He had never been offered the seat. He had simply occupied it long enough that people stopped noticing. He had been Eloise's CFO for 11 years. He had outlasted 2 company restructurings, 1 regulatory audit, and 1 buyout attempt. He believed this made him the reason the company still existed. He had said so, in slightly different language, more times than anyone had counted. Mireille was seated 3 chairs to his left. Close enough to hear everything, far enough to be ignored. The dinner moved through its courses without incident. Regional reports, timber pricing projections, a brief acknowledgement of the anniversary of the mill expansion. Donovan spoke for 14 minutes without anyone asking a question because no one was going to ask Donovan a question in front of investors if they could help it. Then Ingrid Solberg said something about Westpine Partners' new development proposal, and Mireille looked up from her plate. Ingrid was pitching preferred harvest window access for Westpine across 3 Ashford-held license zones in the interior. She described it as a regional cooperation agreement. She described it as mutually beneficial. She described it in language that had clearly been prepared with someone who understood exactly which words Donovan found persuasive. Mireille set down her fork. "That kind of access," she said quietly, "would require trust-level board approval." The table shifted in the specific way. Tables shift when someone says something no one expected. Donovan looked at her. Ingrid looked at her. Callister looked at his wine. Donovan said what he said, about the balance sheet, about the 20 minutes, about pretending. He said it with the particular contempt of a man who has been underestimating someone for so long that he has confused familiarity with permission. Mare looked at him. She looked at Callister, who still did not speak. She said, "I know exactly what that document says, Donovan. I helped write the governance structure it falls under." Donovan made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Ingrid touched the stem of her wine glass. Someone near the far end of the table looked at the ceiling. What Mireille did not say, at that table, in front of those 60 people, was everything she knew. She did not say that the Thompson Creek recategorization had been traced to Donovan's division. She did not say that the Westpine access Ingrid was proposing had already been quietly processed through an internal routing code that bypassed trust oversight. She did not say that the finance records had been altered. She did not say that the document in her bag could end the evening differently than anyone in this room expected. She said, "Excuse me," and she left. She walked out through the lobby and into the cool Vancouver air, and she stood under the hotel entrance lights. For a long moment, her coat still inside, the city moving past her like it had no idea what had just happened in that room. She let herself feel it, not for long, but long enough to be honest about it. She had known about Ingrid for 4 months. She had suspected for longer. She had watched her husband make the slow migration from someone she had loved to someone she no longer recognized, and she had told herself that what he needed was time, was patience, was the kind of steady presence her mother had modeled through every hard season of the company. She had held the weight of what she knew and called it loyalty. Standing outside the hotel, watching her own reflection in the glass door, she understood what her mother had known and tried to tell her. Absorbing cruelty is not the same as withstanding it. There is a difference between enduring quietly and disappearing quietly, and she had spent 3 years getting them confused. She called Priscilla. "Send the emergency board notice," she said. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Priscilla did not hesitate. "Confirmed. The quorum documentation is ready. Do you want Aldrich present?" "Yes," Mireille said, "and have the Thompson Creek file on the screen when the room assembles." She ended the call, stood in the dark for 1 more minute, then she went back inside to get her coat. She did not go back to the table. Callister texted 20 minutes later. She read the message. She did not reply. She drove to her mother's original office that night. Not the tower in Vancouver, the old Okanagan building, the one that smelled like pine and old paper, and the specific kind of institutional coffee that Eloise had made in a percolator on a hot plate because she said the machine in the boardroom made it taste like regret. The building was technically a heritage property now, transferred into the trust as part of the estate consolidation. Mireille had a key. She always had a key. The building manager, a woman named Fenella Grange, 67, who had kept the original Beaumont office records for 30 years, was waiting at the side entrance with the lights on. She looked at Mireille's face and did not ask if she was all right. She unlocked the back archive room and stood aside. Inside were the founding documents, the first timber license, the original Beaumont Ridge Trust deed, a black and white photograph of Eloise standing in front of the Kelowna mill on the day it opened, wearing steel-toed boots, and a look that said she had been told this was impossible and found that entertaining. On the desk, sealed in a legal envelope with Mireille's name written in her mother's specific handwriting, was a letter. Mireille had known the letter existed. She had not opened it until now. Her mother's words were not long. "You will know when the time is right, not because things will be easy, but because they will be clear. Protect the company the way I protected you, not out of anger, out of knowledge." Mireille folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Priscilla arrived an hour later, along with Aldrich and a third-party corporate governance specialist named Bertrand Carlaw, 54, who had audited Ashford Timber twice for external regulatory review and whose name on a document meant the document was clean. They worked through the night. The lobby screens at Ashford Timber's Vancouver Tower changed at 6:58 the next morning. One moment they showed the company's standard rotating display, harvest region maps, sustainability certifications, board member photographs, Donovan's name under Chief Financial Officer in the clean sans-serif font Eloise had chosen for the building's signage in 2004. The next moment the screens went dark. Then white text appeared, "Emergency board session, trust authority convened." The lobby security desk got 3 calls in 2 minutes. The morning receptionist, a young woman named Sydney Rock, who had been at Ashford for 8 months, looked at the screen and then at her phone and then at the 2 board members who had just walked in and were no longer walking. Callister arrived at 7:15. He had clearly not slept. He was wearing the same shirt from the dinner, the collar open, his jacket over his arm. He stood in the lobby and read the screen, and the expression on his face moved through several things quickly before settling on something that looked like a man who had just understood a question he had been asking the wrong way for years. Ingrid arrived 4 minutes later in a different car than she usually drove, which Mireille's legal team noted and logged. Donovan came in at 7:22. He wore his usual suit. His face was arranged in the expression he used at public events, the one that communicated authority without effort. He looked at the screens and said nothing, which was unusual. Donovan Hale almost always had something to say about unexpected things. He said nothing because he was calculating. Mireille stepped out of the private elevator at 7:29. She wore black. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a single folder. On the lapel of her jacket was a small pin her mother had worn on the day the company signed its first provincial contract. Eloise had never taken it off during work hours. Mireille had not worn it in public before today. Aldrich Sorrell was standing near the security desk. When he saw the pin, he took off his cap, and held it to his chest. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Two board members who had been waiting on the far side of the lobby stood up when Mireille walked in, then a third stood. Then the morning teams are from the legal department. The motion spread through the room like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. Callister stepped forward. Mireille. She stopped. She did not move toward him. "What is this?" he said. Priscilla answered before Mireille did. "Beaumont is convening the trust board session. She is expected in the boardroom." Callister turned on Priscilla. "Her name is Hale. She's not an officer of this company." Priscilla looked at him with the specific patience of a lawyer who has been waiting 11 months for someone to say exactly the wrong thing. "You are correct," she said. "Mrs. Hale does not hold an officer title." She paused. "Ms. Beaumont holds controlling interest." The lobby went quiet. Donovan's expression changed. Not all at once, in pieces, the way a thing that has been standing for a long time slowly begins to understand what the ground has been doing beneath it. He looked at Mireille. He looked at the pin on her lapel. He had seen that pin before. He had seen it in photographs of Eloise Beaumont that hung in the Heritage Corridor on the 3rd floor, which he had walked past for 11 years without fully registering what he was looking at. The woman he had dismissed at family dinners, the woman whose balance sheet he had publicly questioned the night before, was the daughter of the woman who had built every room they were standing in. Callister shook his head. "That's not possible." Mireille looked at him with something that was not anger and not cruelty. It was something closer to grief that had already finished its worst work. "It was possible," she said, "every single time you assumed it wasn't." The boardroom doors closed behind her. The table was already set. Sealed folders at every chair. Bertrand Carlaw at the screen. Aldrich near the back. Priscilla to her left. The 3 independent board members who had served under Eloise and continued to serve because the trust governance required at least 2 founding-era directors were already seated. Donovan came in last. He had not been stopped. Mireille had not asked for him to be stopped. Some things were more useful witness than refused. He sat in the chair he always sat in and looked at the folders in front of him and said, "This is a misunderstanding." Bertrand clicked to the first slide. Thompson Creek log volume reclassification. The timeline appeared. 6 months of records. Every altered entry cross-referenced against the original mill data and the trust-level approval logs. No trust-level approval had been granted for any of it. Donovan said, "Operational decisions happen below the approval threshold every day." Bertrand said, "Not when the beneficiary company holds a pre-existing relationship with a senior officer's family member." He moved to the next slide. Ingrid Solberg's name appeared, and beside it, a column. West Pine Partners' financial position. 2 quarters of declining timber revenue. 3 missed partner distributions. A loan facility that was 9 weeks from a covenant breach. And beside that, a record of internal Ashford routing codes applied to West Pine's harvest window requests processed through Donovan's division, marked as standard client development and never submitted for review. Callister looked at the screen for a long time. "Dad," he said. Donovan did not look at him. A further file appeared. An internal strategy note from Donovan's office, entered into Ashford's governance platform 3 months earlier. It read, "The current trust oversight structure creates unnecessary friction in operational decision-making. Modernizing approval thresholds for routine third-party access would better reflect current market conditions." The independent board member who had worked with Eloise the longest, a 71-year-old woman named Suzette Mallory, leaned forward and read the note twice. She said, "The trust oversight structure was designed specifically to prevent exactly what is described in the previous 3 slides." Donovan said, "Eloise built that trust in a different era." Mireille looked at him. "That trust," she said, "is the reason this company is not a subsidiary of a Vancouver real estate fund right now. My mother built it because she understood that without written protection, people confuse proximity to power with ownership of it." The room was quiet. She opened the resolution folder. What followed was not dramatic, in the way public humiliations are dramatic. There was no shouting. No one threw anything. No one walked out. The drama was in the steadiness of it, in the way each document produced the next consequence, the way a correctly built machine produces the next output, one after another, without requiring any additional force. Donovan Hale was suspended from all officer duties, pending investigation into unauthorized third-party routing, governance interference, and deliberate circumvention of trust-level approval requirements. He sat very still when Priscilla read the language. He had been at Ashford Timber for 11 years. He had believed for most of them that the company needed him more than it needed its own structure. The look on his face when he understood he had been wrong was not rage. It was something smaller and colder, the look of a man who had been operating in a building he didn't own for so long that he had forgotten to check the deed. The finance manager responsible for the altered Thompson Creek records was placed on administrative leave and removed from all internal systems. He said the changes were categorization corrections. Bertrand showed the edit timestamps. The corrections had been entered 12 minutes after Donovan signed the West Pine routing approval. He stopped talking about categorization after that. West Pine Partners' pending access requests, approved schedules, and any outstanding routing discussions with Ashford Timber were frozen pending full legal review. Ingrid's name appeared in that language. She had been sitting near the back of the room, and Murray had not asked her to leave because some things were more useful witnessed than refused. Ingrid said, "I wasn't part of the financial decisions." Murray looked at her. A vendor compliance call recording appeared on the screen. It had been made on an Ashford corporate line, where all external parties heard the recording notice before the call connected. Ingrid's voice said, "West Pine needs harvest access before the end of this fiscal quarter or we're in real trouble. Callister understands what's at stake. His father understands. All I need is the routing approval and I can manage the rest." Ingrid's expression didn't collapse all at once. It left her face slowly, the way color leaves something left too long in the sun. "That call was private," she said. "It was made on a corporate line," Scylla said. "Every vendor party heard the notification you proceeded." Callister was very still. He had been still for a long time now. The version of himself that had arrived in the lobby, the man with the untucked shirt and the tired face, and the story he had been telling himself about being caught between two complicated situations, was not the man sitting in the boardroom. That man had been set down somewhere between the Thompson Creek timeline and the West Pine call recording. And what was left was someone who could not yet identify himself in the space that remained. He said, "Mireille." She looked at him. He said, "I didn't know about the routing records. I need you to know that." Mireille believed him. That was the worst part. Callister had not engineered the fraud. He had only allowed the conditions for it by deciding, somewhere in the last 3 years, that Mireille was the background of his life rather than its center. He had not conspired with his father. He had simply stopped paying attention to the right things long enough for his father to fill the space. She said, "I believe you didn't know the details." He looked briefly relieved. She said, "But you knew something was wrong with the Thompson Creek numbers 2 months ago. Aldrich told you directly, and you didn't call me. You called your father." The relief left his face. She turned back to the table. Callister Hale's Ashford Timber consulting credentials, internal access privileges, and any operational sponsorship connected to his name were suspended pending review. This was not punishment for the fraud. It was consequence for a different thing. For the 3 years of small decisions that had accumulated into the conditions that made the larger damage possible. Donovan stood up when his badge was collected by the building security coordinator. He said he had run this company's finances for over a decade. Mireille said, "You managed them under a structure my mother built. There is a difference." He had no answer to that. There was no answer to it, because it was true in the specific way that facts are true when they have been quietly accurate for years and only become visible when the wrong person finally insists on looking. The news moved through the building before the boardroom session ended. It moved the way these things always move in companies where people have been watching something build for a long time without being able to name it. By 11 o'clock, every floor had heard. By noon, the regional mill managers had called in asking about the Thompson Creek contracts. Aldrich had briefed the Kelowna team by text. The mill kept running. A business reporter arrived at the building at 12:30. Priscilla gave a prepared statement about an internal governance review, suspended officers pending investigation, and third-party contract freezes. The statement was exact and said nothing about the dinner, nothing about Ingrid, nothing about anyone's marriage. Mireille had decided the night before that whatever happened to Callister and Donovan in the public record would happen because of what they did to the company, not because of what they did to her. Ashford Timber was larger than her humiliation. Her mother had made it that way on purpose. Outside the tower, in the lobby, some of the longer-serving employees had gathered near the glass wall that looked out over the harbor. Aldrich Sorrell was among them. He had worked with Eloise for 23 years. He had known Mireille since she was a child standing in 2 large gloves, counting trees in the Okanagan winter. He watched her name appear on the board notice posted to the internal communications system. Mireille Beaumont, controlling owner. Trust authority confirmed, he said to the woman standing beside him. Eloise would have smiled, not at the trouble, at the steadiness. That was, Mireille later thought, the truest thing anyone said that day. Callister found her in the Heritage Corridor on the 3rd floor in the late afternoon. The corridor held photographs of every Ashford Timber milestone, the first license signing, the first provincial contract, the mill expansion, the international routing partnerships. In every photograph from the founding era, Eloise Beaumont was wearing the same boots. Mary was standing in front of a photograph she had walked past hundreds of times. Her mother at 40, standing in front of the original Kelowna mill, one hand raised against the sun, the other on a fence post, looking at something outside the camera's frame with the focused expression of someone who can already see what a thing is going to become. Callister said her name. She did not move. He said, "I want you to know I'm sorry." She said, "I know you are." He said, "I don't think I knew what I was doing. I think I just stopped seeing you." That sentence was more honest than anything he had said in 3 years, and it cost her something to hear it, because honesty at the end of a thing is its own kind of grief. She said, "That's true, but you didn't stop seeing me because I was invisible. You stopped seeing me because I stopped being new, and when Ingrid was new, I became furniture." He looked at the floor. She said, "I spent 4 years protecting your confidence. I stepped back from decisions I had every right to make so you wouldn't feel secondary. I let your father speak over me at dinners because I didn't want you to have to choose between us. I made myself smaller every time the room required it." She paused, "And I don't regret any of it," she said, "because it told me everything I needed to know." Callister looked up. She said, "I regret that I thought love required me to disappear." He had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say. She was not asking him to answer. She was finishing a thought that had been building since the first time she sat quietly at a table while someone else claimed her mother's work as their inheritance. Priscilla appeared at the end of the corridor with a folder. Mireille walked toward her without looking back. The divorce documentation was clean and complete. The Beaumont Ridge Trust assets were held separately, inherited, protected, and untouched by the marriage in any structural way. Eloise had been careful about that, as she had been careful about everything. Personal property, some accounts, and the Vancouver house would go through the standard process. None of it was complicated. None of it was contested. Callister did not contest anything. That was, Mireille thought, the last good thing he did. Weeks later, Mireille sat in the Kelowna boardroom at the original Beaumont Ridge property. Not the Vancouver Tower. The old one with the pine floors and the percolator that still made bad coffee, and the window that looked out over the first mill Eloise had ever built. The board had confirmed her as active chair. Her first act was not punishment, and not reorganization. It was restoration. She announced a worker safety enhancement fund in her mother's name, accessible to the families of mill and harvest employees who faced medical costs, sudden loss, or equipment-related injury. She ordered a full ethics framework review and an external governance audit of all third-party contracts. She created a formal reporting channel for employees who identified irregularities, regardless of whether the irregularity came from above them or beside them. She approved a scholarship for the children of Ashford Timber employees, funded from the recovered costs associated with the frozen Westpine agreements. Aldrich, sitting in the back of the room, took off his cap again. The board began to applaud, slowly, and then the hallway beyond the closed door joined in, because people had gathered outside, as people will, when something is finally being said that they have waited a long time to hear. Mireille looked at the table for a moment. She was not cold, she was not triumphant, she was something more difficult to name. Something her mother had been too, in those photographs. A woman who knew exactly where she was standing and had stopped pretending not to. After the session, she walked to the mill yard alone. The machines were running. Workers moved between the conveyor stations and the sorting lines and the stacking areas the way they always did, with the particular efficiency of people who know their work well enough not to think about it separately from themselves. 2 of the younger workers looked up when they saw her. One of them had been at Ashford for 8 months. He had known her only as Mr. Hale's wife. He straightened slightly, uncertain of the protocol. Aldrich walked up beside her. He said, "Ms. Beaumont." She said, "Aldrich." They looked at the mill together for a while without talking. Then he said, "Your mother used to stand right here, this time of year. Said if the light hits the sorting shed at this angle, you know the afternoon shift is going to run clean." Mireille looked at the light on the shed. Then she looked back at the yard, at the timber moving along its careful route from raw material to prepared output, at the machines her mother had chosen, and the systems her mother had built, and the people her mother had hired, and the trust her mother had written, so that none of it could be taken away by someone who had confused nearness with ownership. Callister had thought she was the background. Donovan had thought she was an inconvenience. Ingrid had thought she was a wife in the way that some people think of furniture as something that occupies space without mattering. None of them had understood what she already knew. A company is not a title. A legacy is not a name on a door. Power is not the loudest voice at the table. Power is the person who built the table, and the daughter who understood why, and the trust that made sure neither of them could ever be erased. The afternoon shift began. The machines kept running. Somewhere in the hills above the Okanagan, the timber her family had spent 40 years caring for stood exactly where it had always stood, and Mare Beaumont walked back through the mill yard the way her mother had taught her, without announcing herself, without requiring acknowledgement, and without mistaking silence for absence. She had never needed anyone to know who she was. She had only needed, in the end, to stop pretending she didn't.